Hi, welcome. My name is Liz Ndoye, and I'm here this evening because I'm being sponsored by the Hoboken Public Library. This is the first in a series of classes for September 2020 called Art at Home. For the month of September, we are going to begin focusing on Latino American artists. September and October are Latino American History months, and there are so many brilliant Latino American artists that I really have much material to share with you. Our first artist in the series that we will focus on is named Lucita Hurtado. Lucita Hurtado unfortunately passed away just a few months ago at the age of 99. Interestingly, she really did not become famous until the last 5 years of her life. And it's a wonderful story. Her son, John Mulliken, wanted to start organizing and arranging his father's estate. His father, Mike Mulliken, was also an artist, and not an incredibly famous artist, but a well-known artist in Los Angeles. Well, John started going through his father's work, which filled 3 warehouses, and he was overwhelmed by the extraordinary beauty of his father's work, but then he also stumbled upon his mother's work. Now, he knew that his mother was an artist. She had shown her work throughout his life, but he never realized the extent and quality of her work. He was just blown away by how much work she had and how beautiful it was. He went and talked to her and said, "Mom, it's time for you to showcase your work. The world needs to see more of it." And she agreed and allowed him to catalog her work and find a gallery for her. Right before she died, she had her first solo show at a major private art gallery, the Serpentine Gallery in London. So all those years of being an artist finally paid off at the end of her life. Really such a wonderful story. There is now a solo exhibition of her work at the Los Angeles Museum of Art, and I believe that museum has just reopened. So if you're in the Los Angeles area, do go see it. Lucita was an abstract artist. Really, although she did not call herself a surrealist, I would classify her as a surrealist. Much of her work has that hyper-realism quality to it, and yet it is abstract at the same time because she does pieces of objects so that even though they're done in a realistic style, it's difficult sometimes to tell what they are. She loved nature. She was an environmentalist. A lot of her work, probably the majority of the body of her work, deals with nature and the environment. And she was an activist. She was adamant about the fact that human beings were responsible for the decline in nature, for the destruction of habitats and ecosystems, and for climate change. And her work speaks to that, and we will be looking at her images shortly. So she had a long and wonderful life. She was born in October 1920 in Venezuela, not far from Caracas, and she died August 13th, 2020, so just a few weeks ago. What an amazing artist she was. She spent a lot of time on memory in her work. Her images were about nature, but also memories, powerful memories that she had. For example, she did a series of paintings about feathers because she and her oldest son, Matt Mulligan, also an artist, spent time across the street from their apartment in New York in the grounds of the Museum of Natural History. And he loved feathers, so they collected feathers together. She had such a fond memory of those hours that they spent looking at feathers and bringing them home that she did a series of paintings about feathers. So nature was big for her, memory and nostalgia was important to her, and also the female body. You will see that she uses the female form quite a bit in her work. Her style changed dramatically through the years, which showed that she was quite an adept, gifted artist, and she never wanted to get stuck in a rut. She was always looking for new ways to convey how she felt. She was a very upbeat, optimistic person, and her work does really give off a joyful spirit. She believed, particularly close to the end of her life, that what we should do is just take joy somehow in every day. Find beautiful things to look at, pick up a paintbrush and paint. Don't worry about what it looks like, but find beauty and joy in life. We're now going to look at some images of her work, and then I will talk to you about a project that you can create from inspiration that I'm about to give you in this first class for September in the series Art at Home, sponsored by the Hoboken Public Library. We're looking now at one of Lucita's paintings from her Feather series. I particularly love this image because of the negative space of the sky behind the floating feathers. For me, it's very figurative. This could be a head, these could be arms, these could be legs, this could be the belly and torso. So again, very surrealistic. The feathers are painted in a highly realistic way, and yet it's very abstract. It's quite brilliant composition. The fact that she chose to lay only this feather over a piece of white cloud and the other feathers are only against the blue shape of the sky really creates for an exciting image. Also, I believe these are mountain caps framing the whole image, and then the shape of the clouds mirror the shape of the mountaintops. It's really genius composition. So Lucita Hurtado was actually born Luisa Amelia Garcia Rodriguez. She was born just outside of Caracas in the seaside town of Maiquetía, Venezuela, to Father Pedro Jose Garcia and Mother Teolinda Rodriguez. Lucita was the middle child, with a sister Maria Cecilia, 2 years her senior, and a brother Pedro Jose, 2 years her junior. She has fond memories of her early years in Venezuela, saying, "I remember sitting in the stream on a very hot day, eating a mango and thinking to myself, life cannot get better than this." I was maybe 8 years old. She also has an early memory of watching a butterfly emerging from a cocoon when she was a small child, and of being overwhelmed by the sense of witnessing something miraculous. She often caught butterflies and pinned them to a board so that she could examine the extraordinary designs on their wings. Although she later felt sad about having hurt the insects and considered it a great sin, at the age of 98 she remarked, "I'm still saying sorry to that butterfly, and I hope it hears me." When she was just a few years old, Hurtado's mother left the children's father and took their oldest daughter, Maria, to live with her in New York, leaving Lucita to be raised by her father's aunt Manana and her grandmother Rosario, who taught her to sew, crochet, and embroider. By the time she was 8 years old, Hurtado's mother had raised enough money to bring her to New York. Hurtado never saw her father again, and her brother was left behind in Venezuela. Once in New York and reunited with her sister, the family lived in the Latino neighborhood of Inwood, along with several aunts and cousins. Hurtado recalls the excitement of seeing snow for the first time, but the transition to living in the United States was also a challenge, as Hurtado spoke no English at the time. Her mother worked as a seamstress and had remarried a Cuban man who bought Lucita art supplies and encouraged her creativity. I chose this painting by Hurtado because it feels to me very much like a Picasso or even a Matisse. She had a long, fascinating life, and she met a lot of the great artists of the 20th century, and I believe she was probably influenced by them. Again, this has a very strong Picasso feeling to it. I believe these are female figures, and you can see, though, that they are abstracted and done in a very, very abstract way. Very cubist, almost. Love the colors that she used in this, and the black outlining that she employed makes for a powerful image as well. In New York, Hurtado chose to attend Washington Irving All-Girls High School near Gramercy Park. Even though it meant a 2-hour commute on the subway each day, it was a good school, and she felt committed to her education. Although her mother believed she was studying dress design at high school, she was actually studying fine art and theater, as well as becoming interested in anti-fascist political movements. Hurtado recalls that at graduation, my mother saw that it was an art school, and she was very upset. But I said that, you know, this was my passion, and she understood. After completing high school, she met a Chilean journalist twice her age, Daniel del Solar, who she fell in love with, and he became her first husband at the age of 18. They spent time in the Dominican Republic, but because they were against Trujillo, the head of the Dominican army, they were forced to cross into Haiti and then finally back to New York, where they settled in the village on Christopher Street. In 1946, Hurtado saw the first photographs of Earth taken from outer space, which had a profound effect on her. She recalls, "When I saw the first photographs of the world, where you saw this little planet in the darkness of space, it gave me the same feeling of tenderness that you have for family, for your own children. I feel very much that I'm part of this planet. This sense of interconnectivity between humans and nature has been a central theme in her work ever since." In 1946, Isamu Noguchi invited Hurtado to visit a museum, and that began a long friendship with that famous artist. She also met Arshile Gorky and Rufino Tamayo at Isamu Noguchi's studio, where Noguchi held extravagant parties. She also met Frida Kahlo in New York and Diego Rivera. Rufino Tamayo introduced Hurtado to Pierre Matisse, who introduced her to artists such as Marc Chagall and Juan Miro. On one occasion, Hurtado recalls being on a bus heading to an opening at Matisse's gallery on East 57th Street and there was a man who wasn't sitting down, and he kept staring and staring at me, and he looked tough like a wrestler or some truck driver. When she hurried off the bus and arrived at the gallery, she says, Pierre was standing at the door. I was going to say, this guy's been following me and I'm upset. And he looked past me to this man and he spoke in French. Oh, I want you to meet, and the man was Fernand Léger. In 1942, Hurtado gave birth to her second son, Pablo del Solar, and in 1945, her husband was hired by Time magazine in Washington, D.C. They moved to a Latin community in Falls Church, Virginia, but only for a brief time. Del Solar abandoned Hurtado and their two sons, and after the divorce, Hurtado moved back into their old apartment on 95 Christopher Street. She started attending artist gatherings at the Automat in New York, where she met Yves Tanguy, Max Ernst, Joseph Albers, André Breton, and William de Kooning. In 1945, Hurtado's mother moved back to Venezuela, and Hurtado moved into her mother's New York apartment on 85th Street with her two infant sons and her cousin Herminia. She became friends with Roberto Mata's first wife, and the friendship grew. She met many artists, including Marcel Duchamp, and then later in her life, she met and married Mike Mulliken in 1957. They traveled by boat from New York to Morocco. They lived in Rome for a while, where they met Peggy Guggenheim. And they spent time in Europe traveling around and eventually settled back in Los Angeles. They spent time in Croton Falls, New York, and landed in Los Angeles, where Mulliken got a job teaching at UCLA. They had two sons together, John and Matt, and they had a wonderful life together. They fell in love with New Mexico, where they bought a property, and they own two homes, one in New Mexico and one in Los Angeles. So this piece that we're looking at now is still from earlier part of her career. You can see the European influence on her work, still highly abstract, although you can see a figurative shape here. And it feels a great deal to me like Léger or Picasso. Wonderful use of color. I love the juxtaposition of the orange with the blue down here. Very powerful and strong. Again, interesting composition. These kind of curving shapes over here echo or mirror the curved shapes of these objects over here. I like the verticality of this white, strong shape up the middle. And for me, really, the focal point of the painting is this area here. And I think it's because of the white and yellow and a little bit of black contrast going on. There's also a lot of movement. These shapes to me feel as if they're almost flying. In her later period, during the 1970s, Hurtado got to know many more women artists working in the Los Angeles area. She organized a lunch at her own home for what she termed the Los Angeles Council of Women Artists, inviting artists like Vija Selmans, Makoto Idemitsu, Alexis Smith, Miriam Shapiro, and Judy Chicago. Hurtado says that up to the time I joined the group, I had faced my paintings to the wall whenever a visitor arrived unexpectedly at my studio. This secretiveness was perhaps the result of working alone, or perhaps related back to the time in art school when I could show my mother still lifes and landscapes, but never work done in the life class. The change came about imperceptibly, but after being in the group for a while, I discovered that I was less inhibited. I have never again faced my paintings to the wall. Quite on the contrary, I am quick to show them. Many members of the Los Angeles Council of Women Artists went on to form the Women's Building, Women's Space, and Women's Space Gallery in Los Angeles. Hurtado held her first solo exhibition at the Women's Building in 1974. Around the same time, the West Coast chapter of the feminist consciousness-raising group Guerrilla Girls invited Hurtado to collaborate with them. However, she opted to decline. She says, just the name was too much. I thought it was the wrong approach to art. This image that we're looking at now is a self-portrait. It is her feet. You can see, again, the surrealistic quality to her work. The toes of her feet, the apples that you see, look so three-dimensional, as if you could literally touch them and feel the volume of the feet and the objects. I love that she's looking down at her feet. It's quite an amazing composition. The thought that the artist could be looking from above, kind of the bird's eye view, is very unusual. Very few artists have ever done that. The patterning of the textile that her feet and the apples are resting on is very Latin American, and the colors are so beautiful. There's something so pleasing about the spiky quality in the pattern and then the spiky jutting position of her toes. That works really well compositionally. And the fact that the apples are off-center really makes the viewer's eye travel from one side of the image to the other. Again, really amazing. What made her do this, too? This is the kind of thing that makes art fine art and not just craft. Notice the way she places this foot almost completely off the page. You can only see the tips of 3 toes. And that, combined with where this apple is, really makes for just a dynamic, wonderful composition. Genius, genius, genius. Her use of light and dark, too, is very, very beautiful. I love the light highlights on the top and sides of the feet and on the apples. From the work she started in the 1970s, Hurtado became a leader in the feminist art movement. She started using female body imagery at a time when most female artists did not dare do that. We can't know now to what extent she influenced other feminist artists, but I like to believe that her influence was probably huge. She said at the end of her life, "My life is very, very happy. I'm one of those people whose cup is half full always, never empty. At my age, you're near the exit, eh? It's all a surprise. I don't think it's going to be the end either. I think there are just borders in this existence. I think it goes on. I expect to fly at some point. Who knows? My next life is going to be a grain of sand." And at the age of 99, Hurtado died at her home in California. This is one of her more female images. It may be a self-portrait. It's definitely a female form. And it's one of my favorites because of the way she used the black lines in the middle of the image. Notice the way the 3 lines in the middle go over her forearm here, where the rest of the lines go underneath. I don't know what made her do that, but again, it's complete genius, and it's what makes this painting incredibly interesting for me to look at. And this is the last image we're going to look at tonight because it's going to be our segue into the project that we are going to do for this week's Art at Home lesson. This is done in the technique of Crayon Resist. Many of you who are veteran students of mine, you will remember doing Crayon Resist, but for those of you who are new to this, I'm going to show you how to do it, and I believe you will enjoy it. One final thing I want to say about this image, I love, love, love the colors. I love these earth tones and red. I just love them. First, let me explain what Crayon Resist means. Crayon is a wax-based medium. We are going to draw first in crayon and also in oil pastel. Oil pastel is also an oily, waxy base. And once we've completed our drawing, then we're going to paint over the top with watercolor paint. Hurtado actually used colored inks. If you're lucky enough to have colored inks at home, please do use that. They are quite expensive though, and there are inks called Doc Martin inks, which really are so beautiful. The wonderful thing about inks as opposed to watercolor paint is that they are much more vibrant in color and intensity. So if you want to invest, if you fall in love with Crayon Resist, if you want to invest, you can get colored inks in large quantities. They're always cheaper if you buy in large amounts. All right, so in a moment I'm going to show you a drawing that I've started. I'm going to do a little bit more drawing on it, and then I will talk to you about the final step, the painting. So this is a drawing I worked quite a bit on before starting shooting this lesson, filming this lesson, and it just really needs a few finishing touches before we do the final step of painting. I did a lot of work with crayon. Now I'm going to outline some of the shapes to emphasize them, and I'm going to outline them in black. You want to use a rather thick coating of crayon and oil pastel. You don't want to do it lightly. If you don't bear down and make a thick coat of crayon or oil pastel, the final step of painting over the image with watercolor paint will not work. So here I'm adding some outline. I'm using a black oil pastel. Artists love to outline. It really adds a bit of pop to a finished piece, and it helps to emphasize and see the more important parts of the composition. My crayon just broke, my oil pastel just broke. It's all good. It doesn't matter. I really want to emphasize the vertical parts of this drawing. Oh, and I forgot to mention, I was sitting, I'm lucky enough to have a backyard, and I was sitting in my backyard looking at one of my house plants that I affectionately call my elephant ear plant because it has giant leaves. And I mainly focused on the big leaves when I created this drawing. So I would recommend that you do something from nature because Hurtado was all nature and motherhood were two big themes in her work, so look for something, some natural forms on a walk that you take. Maybe you have photographs from a vacation that are filled with nature. And keep your drawing simple. Another tip, I did some color in the background, but you want to leave as much white as you can in the background, because remember, our next step is going to be to paint over our drawing. Now, this can be nerve-wracking if you've never done it before, but you will see that the drawing I've created will not get covered up by the paint. And here's why. It's science. Wax and oil-based media will not take water-based media. So watercolor paint, thin down acrylic will work. You can paint right over the entire drawing, and the paint will only stick where there is no crayon or oil pastel. Here we go. I've used a lot of green in this, so I think I'm going to do a background color in the red family. Maybe put a tiny bit of green in it. If you remember from our color mixing sessions, green and red, when mixed together, neutralize each other and become a grayish brown color. So you can see I'm using a very large brush. I'm not being careful at all, and I am painting right over the drawing I already created. It's so much fun. It's very loose, very relaxing, and fast. It took me actually several hours to do the drawing, laying on all the heavy crayon. It was time consuming. It was also enjoyable though. But this part you should be able to do in just a couple of minutes. Bear with me, I just need to get a little more red out of the tube. I was so thrilled to see that Hurtado used this technique. She may be the first adult artist that I know of who actually used it in their professional practice. That would be fun to research to see if you can find other artists who did Crayon Resist. It is one of my favorite things to teach young children. Those of you who are sheltering at home with kids, kids love this because it's kind of magic. But again, it's just science. Wherever the wax and the crayon are on your page, on your paper, the paint will not adhere. All right, just about done. I think this is the first class when I've been able to finish a piece for you, so you'll get the full impact of how this technique works. Inspired by the very wonderful Latina American artist Lucita Hurtado. Do look her up. I'm going to hang this up so that you can see it better. Here's the finished piece. Although I may revisit it, artists really are never satisfied with their work, and knowing when you're done is really, really difficult. That comes with experience and hard work. But very abstract. I think you can see the plant forms that I created, and the thing you might really be struck by is the color. So check out your color wheels. If you've never taken the color mixing classes with me, you can visit the Hoboken Public Library website and see those classes. But just a refresher, red and green are complementary colors. They're opposite each other on the color wheel, red being a primary color, green a secondary color. And when you juxtapose them next to each other, they have an incredible chemistry. They really, really create an exciting dynamic. Again, our project for tonight, Crayon Resist, inspired by the late great Latina American, Venezuelan American artist Lucita Hurtado. Please look for her work online, her images online. You are going to really enjoy what she created. And I hope that it will inspire you to do your own Crayon Resist. Draw first in crayon or oil pastel, paint right over it in watercolor. Finally, I want to thank the Hoboken Public Library for hosting our Art at Home classes. I just read an article in the New York Times this week about how people who are quarantined or sheltering at home during the pandemic are finding creative activities as stress relievers. They're moving more and more into doing creative projects in order to help them weather this storm. So I do hope that you do your own art at home. Either use the techniques that I've taught you, or maybe they'll inspire you to go in a whole nother direction. And I hope to see you next week for our next Latin American artist. We will be doing an entirely different project. If you want to see prior classes, please do visit HobokenLibrary.org and you will find them online. Thank you all. Art on. Enjoy your creative week. Stay healthy, safe, and well.